Is he really going to exert the political pressure that he needs to have people reverse themselves in some way? It almost seems like that's a better hope for TikTok to stick around, but it's not something that we can certainly count on.
Hey gang, it's Monday, November 4th. Jeremy, Zach, and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Nose Daily, the Marketer Podcast. I'm Marcus. Today I'm joined by two people. Let's meet them. We start with our Senior Director of All Things Briefings. He is based in New York City. We call him Jeremy Goldman.
Hey there. What a boring week ahead, right?
It is. Kidding.
I'm being sarcastic. Yes.
Busy. We're also joined by our senior analyst who covers everything retail and e-commerce. He is based in Chicago, just north of the city. We call him Zach Stambor.
Hey, Marcus. Hey, Jeremy.
Hey, fella. So, fact of the day. So we've got a couple of basketball fans on this episode, so I thought I'd go basketball. Who was the first player to dunk a basketball? Just to dunk one, not necessarily in a certain league. Do you guys know? I had no idea. Do you know how early it was? Maybe a year, perhaps, you could give me?
1954.
Earlier.
I was going to say something right around there. Yeah, I'll say 1958.
Oh. According to Jacob Uiti of The Guardian, it's believed that the first ever dunk in organized basketball occurred in 1936 when 6'8" Texan Joe Fortenberry performed one in the Berlin Olympics for the US basketball team on the way to winning the sport's first ever gold medal. Close to a decade later, in 1944, the first dunk was recorded in college basketball when 7-foot center Bob Kurland of Oklahoma A&M threw one down. And then I couldn't find one for when the ABA or the NBA or any of the men's professional leagues, the first dunk in one of those. But on July 30th, 2002, Lisa Leslie made history as the first player to dunk during a WNBA game. It was 5 years after the league was created.
Did you know basketball was in the Olympics in 1936? I would have thought it was later than that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Surprising. Best dunk ever? There's only one right answer here, gents, okay? And if you get it wrong, you're off the episode! I'm kidding, I need you.
Is it Spud Webb?
Oh my goodness, no. Although that's pretty impressive. Was he 4'2"?
No, he was 5'7", and he was amazing.
Yeah, he was. Guesses, Zach?
I mean, I think you have to go Michael Jordan, free throw
I
line.
knew you'd go Michael Jordan. The Chicago people!
Course.
Best dunk ever, Vince Carter. Sydney Olympics, when he jumped over 7'2" Frederick Weiss. Do you remember this dunk?
Okay, that's probably right, but it's also not like something that you can quantitatively prove.
I don't even think it's his
the
best dunk, though.
But it's
Oh my goodness. He jumped over, his head goes between the guy. With you guys. He jumped over the...
You just wanted to bring up Frederick Weiss because the Knicks, drafted him and he was awful.
That's also true, yes. Anyway, today's real topic, how the outcome of the US presidential election will affect some critical economic factors for retail and advertising. All right, gents, so you've been working on a project that looks at what happens if Mr. Donald Trump is president again and what happens if Miss Kamala Harris becomes president, and what different aspects of our lives, of advertisers' lives, will look like in those differing universes. And you've gone through a bunch of different topics, but there's a few we want to focus on today. Inflation is where we'll begin. It's something that we have talked about quite recently, actually. I think the three of us were talking about it as it pertains to consumer sentiment and how prices going up makes people feel. So we have covered it quite recently. But what does inflation look like in the world of a Trump presidency or a Harris presidency? Well, just to set the table, from mid-2022 to mid-2023, so for that year, inflation fell from the 9% high we all remember to 3%. From mid-2023 to mid-2024, it hovered in the kind of 3 to 4% range. But as we've hit fall, it's dipped below 3% for the first time in 3.5 years. So with inflation now at 2.4% as of September, I don't have the October numbers yet. Zach, what happens to inflation? Let's start with Ms. Harris. What happens to inflation if Kamala Harris becomes president?
Yeah, so we just got the Q3 GDP numbers, which include within that the PCE numbers, which is the Fed's preferred inflation indicator. And it was down at 1.5% in Q3, or if you pull out the volatile areas for the core number, it's 2.2%. So we're
Okay.
right around the Fed's target.
Hmm.
And there's very little reason to believe that that downward trajectory would change with the Harris administration. There's nothing too dramatic that she's proposing that is likely to pass that would change that trajectory.
Hmm.
This is something that the Wall Street Journal pointed out, which is not really a liberal leaning publication generally, is that leading economists increasingly in October feel that Trump's policies are more inflationary than they believe them to be in July, the more he talks about and articulates his plan. So I don't know. I just think that's interesting. I think it's always good to, try to trust experts. Like there are some people who think that there's no material difference, but generally, a significant number, it moved from 56%, I believe, thought that Trump would be more inflationary to moving to 68% in October.
Yeah.
So it's clearly kind of moving in that direction from leading economists that follow this stuff very
And
closely.
Harris is at 12%, right? And there's a 68% say Trump, 12% say Harris, and then the rest kind of said it won't really have any kind of impact on inflation.
Yeah, just kind of a shrug emoji. But the Trump campaign has very few policies, but the policies they do have out there, the ones that Donald Trump talks about all the time, are very inflationary. And so there's good reason that economists think that his policies will spark inflation. And that starts with tariffs. Tariffs raise prices. It's 1 + 1 = 2.
Yeah.
It just tariffs raise prices. And we saw this last time around when Donald Trump was president, and he slapped some targeted tariffs on washing machines. And then consumers paid more for washing machines. And they also paid more for dryers because manufacturers used the opportunity to hike prices on dryers in addition to washing machines. And these tariffs are likely to be widespread and not targeted. And so prices will rise. And then the other policy that he's talked about quite a bit is mass deportation, which will have a negative labor supply shock, which will also drive inflation. And perhaps could also lead to stagflation because it would likely lead to slower economic growth. And then the one final piece that also is inflationary is Trump talks quite a bit about putting his thumb on the scale of an independent Fed. And there's a whole slew of political science research out there that shows when a central bank is independent, it is able to keep prices in check far more than one in which it's not independent and somebody's steering the ship who perhaps shouldn't be.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jen. So that's kind of where things are in terms of inflation, what that indicator will look like under both the candidates. Let's move to another one that you talk about, Jeremy, more on your side of things, and you writing about what happens to high growth digital advertising channels like CTV and retail media. For context, how high growth are they at this point? Where are they going to go up or down from, to give people to kind of level set folks? CTV is a $29 billion business growing at a 19% clip this year, and retail media is nearly twice as big, 55 billion, growing even faster than CTV, growing at 26% this year. So Jeremy, what do these channels, these high growth digital advertising channels like CTV and retail media and others, look like if Kamala Harris becomes president?
So Zach and I worked on these. We've been calling them reporticles because they're a little bit longer than a typical article, but we made them available to everybody just because we think that they'll be, helpful if folks have not gone out and voted yet. So we think that from a retail media standpoint, retail media has a strong return on ad spend, or ROAS. That's why it has grown over the course of the last few years. But it obviously does eat into the margins of people who are buying retail media, right? And if your margins get to be a little bit tighter because of inflation, which could very well happen, then do we see it's an interesting paradigm where advertisers are going to be spending still quite a bit on their advertising channels, but they're going to be moving more towards performance marketing channels that have a high ROAS, right? That includes retail media, but retail media is expensive, which then means that if you haven't had success in the channel, we could likely see less people jumping into that channel. And that means imagine like a few more incremental retail media dollars come from existing buyers, but it's harder to get new people to encourage them to get into retail media if it is really tough on your margins that are already being squeezed. So it's a little bit of like there's going to be multiple pressures in both directions on retail media. CTV, I think, is a little bit different. In part, it has grown quite dramatically, as you pointed out, over the last few years. But there's a number of indicators that Harris might push for more privacy legislation that could extend to CTV and targeting. We think, whoever wins this election, it might very well be tied to CTV and really strong targeting in a few key states. So it will certainly have a moment in the spotlight. But it's going to be harder to buy those types of targeted ads if you have some. And again, this is all theoretical, but like some clamping down on data brokers, who trade off of that data that allows for targeting. And we think you could see a bit more of that under Harris than Trump.
So, it kind of sounds like things are going to slow down either way. It doesn't seem like with one candidate necessarily winning that things are going to kind of take off and continue the kind of growth that we've seen. Is that fair to say that there is probably going to be more tepid growth for different reasons based on whichever candidate gets in?
I mean, Zach, I'm curious what you think about this, but I think that what we try to do with this analysis is focus on what is likely to happen, knowing that there's so many variables we don't yet know, right? Like Harris can call for certain legislation, doesn't mean she can necessarily get it, especially if she has a Republican Senate.
Right.
There are some things that Trump can do, but again, a president is just one input in terms of all these other factors. And I know we'll talk a bit about antitrust, which they have some impact on antitrust and regulation, but they certainly can't control the whole entire discussion. There's a lot of checks and balances in our system, which kind of works out in our favor.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, what led to dramatic inflation last time around had really nothing to do with either. Well, it had a little bit to do with the pandemic response, but it had far more to do with the supply chain disruptions that were the result of the pandemic response around the world. And so the president, or even the broader US government, really doesn't have that much to do with that. So while we can look at what the president may influence, there's a lot of other factors at play that could lead to any number of things occurring.
Yep. Yeah, it seems like we're expecting growth to slow, whoever becomes president. Even if I become president, that's not true. Life would be pretty terrible. Although everyone would get free peanut butter under a Marcus Johnson presidency. So just think about that for 2028. Okay.
Well, would it be chunky or smooth?
It could be anything you want, Zach.
Okay,
that's why people would vote for me. I know the way to the American's heart. Go on.
So, I think if Harris wins, I don't think growth will slow that dramatically. I think we'll kind of see the same sort of trajectory that we've been seeing in terms of consumer spending, at least. And consumer spending is pretty strong. Again, to go back to the GDP numbers, consumer spending was like 3.7%, which when you look at inflation, it's well ahead of inflation. And so consumers just keep chugging along, and the consumer seems incredibly resilient. If she's able to increase the minimum wage, which is one of the things she would like to do, that would give some people a little bit more spending power, which again could keep the economy just keep chugging along.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's also, of course, we're speaking during earnings season. The results, I know mainstream and Wall Street are not the same thing, but we've seen very good results from those companies. So that's another kind of argument that things will be in, positive territory in a lot of ways for at least, some time to come. But those companies, whoever is president next, are going to have more difficult quarters to anniversary and increase their gains over, just because now they have like a little bit more favorable territory. They're being compared to year over year. Next year, I don't know if you're going to be able to say the same thing in Q3.
Yeah.
If Trump wins and inflation rises, we will likely see a similar sort of scenario to what we saw in 2022, where retail sales jumped, but real sales declined. Consumers pulled back on discretionary spending, and it was just kind of a tough situation for retailers. And so we'll likely see something along that sort of scenario if Trump wins, whereas if Harris wins, it'll probably be somewhat of a status quo.
Yeah. Yeah, in terms of consumer spending, yeah, I agree with you. In terms of ad spending, some of this is just the law of large numbers. Like CTV, for example, is getting to the point, it's getting to the size now. I mean, it's 7% of all ad spending in the country this year and obviously growing next year. And so that's going to go from 19% growth this year to 13% growth next year. Still very good. It's double digit on tens of billions of dollars. But then retail media, that's slowing a bit, but not as much as you'd expect, given that it's a $55 billion space, 26% growth this year. It's 24% growth next year. And that's, like I said, before we even know who's going to be in office. Let's end, gents, by talking about regulation. And Jeremy, I think in the piece that you wrote, you were saying that the future of tech regulation, TikTok's potential ban, the direction of antitrust actions like what's going on with Google and others hinge on who takes office, you write. So I'll start with you. What are some of the things you want to point out regulation-wise or in terms of regulatory priorities if both Ms. Harris and Mr. Trump win?
Yeah, it was a really interesting thing in particular to look at the fate of TikTok. But we looked at a number of different variables here, and ultimately we kind of came to the conclusion that Trump more recently has said that, he plans to save the app if reelected. He does have pressure from a major ByteDance investor who has given him quite a bit of support in terms of saving it. But, then he still faces some pressure from groups like Project 2025, that are calling for TikTok's ban, on account of national security. But then there's just ultimately a question of a lot of Republicans voted for the bill that Biden signed a while back. So is he really going to exert the political pressure that he needs to have people reverse themselves in some way? Right. That is, it almost seems like that's a better hope for TikTok to stick around, but it's not something that we can certainly count on. For Harris,
really quickly, it's also particularly hard because he supported the ban in 2020 and now he's opposing it. And so it's not like he has this track record of being against the thing or for the thing. And so it's even more hard to have a gauge on what he's going to do if he gets elected when it comes to TikTok.
Right. It's not like this would be the first time a politician has reversed themselves, obviously, either of these candidates. But yeah, it's an interesting water to shift. And I think that just because, Harris had quite a brat summer and her campaign has done quite well on TikTok, is she going to really use any type of political goodwill just because her voters are going to increasingly be Gen Z and female, and TikTok, over indexes on both of those, but she doesn't have to essentially do anything or intervene. She can just be like, it's out of my hands and not really take any action. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we'll get dinged in terms of goodwill necessarily. Yeah. So once you're in office, you obviously don't have to worry about a number of things that you had to worry about beforehand.
Yeah. The other piece of TikTok, though, is TikTok Shop, where a whole lot of stuff is coming from China, which, to go back to tariffs, will have 60% tariffs on it. So, TikTok Shop, Temu, Shein, all these platforms may have a hard time just existing in a Trump administration, or they'll have to shift gears quite a bit.
Yeah.
They've sought to do that to some extent, but they would have to embark on some pretty massive changes in order to make their business models work, because it's all about cheap stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Temu and Shein, though, Zach, I see it a lot more. I think with TikTok Shop, they've spent so much money to try to make it a thing. And if they don't have to try to make it a thing nearly as much. If a new strategy is foisted on them, maybe that actually winds up being in their favor. If they wind up staying in the market but without Shop, maybe that I'm not entirely convinced that wouldn't be good for them, just because they've propped it up, as you know, with so much money to try to make this market.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think if they can shift the product mix a bit or a lot, it would undoubtedly make it a more powerful platform.
So, Zach, how about for you? What are you paying close attention to when it comes to regulation and what happens if either of these candidates gets elected?
Yeah, so if Harris wins, it's a little bit nebulous in terms of what exactly she's going to do if she sticks with the status quo. We've seen a very activist regulatory state. And so we likely will see more scrutiny in terms of mergers, which there's a whole lot of them. One of the things that she has talked a bit about is a proposed ban on price gouging. It's not the strongest policy that she has put forth. It's only in the case of disasters, although some have suggested a president could basically call anything a disaster and move on that. But in that case, there's probably going to be continued high scrutiny of the mergers like the Kroger-Albertsons deal, which I think is pretty unlikely to actually happen if she takes office, and the Mars-Kellanova deal as well, because those deals likely would lead to higher grocery prices.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, that's all we've got time for today's episode. If you want to go and read all of the different factors that the gents wrote about as it pertains to how the outcome of the US presidential election will affect 3 critical economic factors for retail and then 3 separate ones for advertising, then the link to both of those pieces, the retail piece and the advertising piece from Jeremy and Zach, are in the show notes, of course. That's what we've got time for today's episode. Thank you so much to my guests for hanging out with me today. Thank you to Jeremy.
Thank you so much. Go vote, everybody.
Yes, indeed. Thank you to Zach.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you to Victoria, who edits the show. Stuart runs the team, and Sophia does our social media. Thanks to everyone for listening in. We hope to see you tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Daily, the Marketer podcast.